As is probably obvious, the room is a little bit bigger than we perhaps need. Please note, the exits are here and here. Microphones are in the middle and in the front. If you want to sit all the way up there and expect to speak at the microphone, that's too bad, because we're not going to wait for you to run all the way down the stairs. So do sit down here if you think you will talk. If you are one of my speakers, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. No, wait, you don't. Okay, good. You're in the right spot, because I want you to be able to make your way to the stairs to come up on stage, where you too will feel like you are suddenly in a massive lecture hall. We have 3 drafts to discuss and 1 or 2 AOB items. Share slides. Confirm. Start this. As always, we're going to start with the, does that work?
You'll have to plug it into your machine.
Yep.
Does it work?
I don't know.
No, it doesn't.
Or not. Well then,
Okay.
wait, shouldn't it work in here? I would have thought it worked. Yes. You would think it was that. Oh, for the love of God. Or I can just sit here and argue with my computer. That will always be fun too. Okay. We are going to be going through the note well. Everyone is familiar with the note well? Yes? Nod your heads. Good. Thumbs up. That works too. And you're familiar with the various and sundry IETF meeting tips. If you are here, you are sitting somewhere more towards the front. You have joined via Meet Echo so that we can get a count of how many people are attending, which is possibly part of how we ended up with this room, because I think last time we had 100 people attending, at least here on remote. For remote participants, please make sure your audio is off, unless you are presenting or asking a question, and headsets, we all love them very much. Do I have volunteers for scribes? If you scribe, you get to use the cute little desk that comes with your chair. Thank you, Hank.
Thank you. We need
Note
a
taker.
note taker.
Oh, you're going to be picky, are you? All right, thank you. I'm going to go through a bit of a welcome. As I mentioned, we have 3 documents in queue, and we do have at least 1 AOB, possibly a second one that snuck in about 10 minutes ago. How many of you know what SPICE is? How many of you are new? New people, raise your hand. Thank you. You are why I made these next slides. Yes. So in our charter, it says very specifically that we're basically looking at digital credentials and presentations and how to address some of the gaps that, goodness knows, there's more than 1 or 2 or 5 or 20 different specs and drafts out there right now talking about digital credentials and whatnot. But even with that many, there are still gaps in this space. This group is trying to fill some of those. We are developing profiles that support the use cases that we come up with. And in fact, we have a use case document. It is in the form of an internet draft. It is not intended to be published as an RFC, where we are capturing those use cases. If you've got one that isn't in there, we should work on that. We are, as always, concerned with the security and privacy of the credentials that are in use. While a lot of the credentials we've been talking about specifically in SPICE focus on some of the more non-human use cases, it's very rarely that tidy, where it's only non-human. Sometimes there's certainly a human overlap. And even, non-humans are people too, at least to the point that there are privacy considerations there as well. We do have several other groups. When people at Newcomers ask me about this session, I said, this is, SPICE is fantastic, but you should consider it as part of a family of working groups, all of which have interrelated and interesting things going on. For example, there's RATS, which is actually happening in the next session after this one, remote attestation procedures. OAuth, of course, the granddaddy of all of these things, and they meet 3 times, not on Friday this week, but they've met the first and second time already. Jose, Coze, Skit, Whimsy, all of these things, Whimsy and Skit in particular, have not happened yet. So if you're looking for other things to do to figure out how it all comes together, I highly recommend you pay attention to those groups as well. Cozy hasn't happened yet either, so recommended. What are we not doing? We are not doing key discovery, and we are not doing new cryptographic primitives. Out of scope. If you want to do those things, good on you. We'll find a different place for that to happen because it ain't going to be here. Different working group resources are available, of course. There is the mailing list, there is GitHub, and there is a very pretty landing page, which I completely 100% totally cribbed from what Whimsy is doing, and we thank them very much for leading the way in that area, such that all I had to do was edit HTML. And with that, let's get the first item up, which is Mike. We're doing the selective disclosure for CBOR web tokens. Ah,
Rowan's going to do it for us. Great.
confirm your selection.
There are stairs right there. Yeah.
Okay, I can't do that.
Hi, everybody. Rowan May. Okay. Next slide, please. There we go. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about a few different aspects, and somebody else is going to come up and talk here later, but I'm going to give the intro to selective disclosure. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is a selective disclosure? Well, a selective disclosure COT is something that allows the holder to get a CBOR web token, CWT or COT, from an issuer, and then safely either blind or reveal some of its claims to a verifier. When we say blind, we may also use the term redact. And when we say reveal, we may use the term disclose. So a holder can disclose all, some, or none of the disclosable claims. So for example, a holder might be my phone, an issuer might be an identity service, and a verifier might be a website or someone who is in the same chat room as me and wants to see who am I or some attribute about me. So how does this relate to regular CBOR web tokens? So every selective disclosure COT is also a valid COT, but not necessarily vice versa. How does an issuer decide which claims to selectively disclose? That's out of scope. We're not going to discuss that in SPICE. That could be something maybe OAuth does, or some, OpenID Connect or some other group, right? We're not dealing with that. The issuer does not have to make all of the claims disclosable. It could make a lot of them disclosable. I'll talk about that a little bit later. A selective disclosure COT does include the holder's public key, or one of the holder's public keys that it uses for this purpose, or a reference to it. And it does that using the confirmation claim or CNF claim. And let's go to the next slide, please. So what can be disclosed in a selective disclosure COT? Well, what can't be disclosed, we would start with any COT claim that is part of the validation of a COT, with the exception of the subject. So there's some examples up here. So the issuer, the audience, expiration time, not before time, the time that the COT was issued, yeah, a bunch of stuff there, right? So what can be disclosed? The subject can be disclosed. That's the first highlighted item there. Any other claims at any level of hierarchy. So in this case, I'm showing 2 different levels of hierarchy. I've got a claim called age at least 18, which is highlighted, second item highlighted. And then I've got inside of an address claim, the address claim is a CBOR map, and inside that I have a region claim. So I could choose to selectively disclose that or any of the things at that level as well.
Just a clarification, Ron. When you say that the issuer, audience, those things at the top there can't be disclosed, I think you're saying that they must be disclosed.
I'm saying that they must be included in the COT unredacted.
Yeah, right.
They are not, they can't be blinded or / redacted. They're always there. They're
They
always
can't be
gonna be.
redacted.
If it was there, it's mandatory to continue to present it. It cannot be removed from the issuer COT. Thank you, Marvin. Finally, let me just finish one more thought and then I'll. So the last thing, the last type of thing that we can make selectively disclosable is an element, an item inside of an array. And so in this case, I highlighted 4.17 as one of the 2 software versions in an array here in the SW version claim.
I had the same linguistic confusion that Martin did. You used the phrase, "this can't be disclosed." I think what you meant to say was this can't be selectively disclosed.
Yeah.
Those mean the opposite thing, actually.
Okay. Is anyone else confused now that I have said the wrong thing and been corrected?
We have Daniel in queue.
Go ahead.
Mike's words were attributed to me by the chat. But yeah, Daniel said, why is sub not selectively disclosable?
Why is what not selectively
The
disclosable?
subclaim. Subject.
The subject is selectively disclosable. That's the first item in this example.
Okay, then I was confused about the point of the confusion, and turns out, yeah, it was the same thing. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so for the purposes of this example, the things which are highlighted in yellow are examples of the kinds of things which are selectively disclosable. Next slide, please. All right, so if we want to disclose something, we need to go and make a disclosure, and the way that we do that depends on the type of thing it is that we're trying to disclose. In all cases, the issuer is going to come up with a random salt of at least 16 bytes. And then it's going to make an array that contains that salt, and then the thing that it wants to make selectively disclosable. So in this case, that first non-subject claim was age at least 18. So we have here the 16 octet salt. We have the CBOR map key, the CBOR claim key of this claim, and the value in an array. So it's a 3-item array. For those that are not really that familiar with looking at CBOR in hexadecimal, that's what that looks like below. So this says, okay, this is a byte string of 22 bytes. Inside that, it says, here's an array of 3 items. The first one is a byte string of 16 bytes. The second one is the number 500, which is, an example of a integer key for the item that has the value true. Okay, next slide, please. If we were doing a selective disclosure of an array item, like the value 4.17, which is one of the SW version, the items in the SW version array, then we would make a 16 octet salt, and then we would also put the value. There's no claim name because because this is an item in the array and it's not representing the entire SW version array, it's representing only one value inside that array. Again, if you were curious, there is a example of, this is what the hexadecimal for that particular disclosure would look like. Next slide, please. So once we have these disclosures, the issuer will take a hash of each of these disclosures to become the redacted form of that claim or array element, or in some cases, a decoy, which I'll talk about later. So then these hashes are placed in the payload of the COT issued by the issuer, and then it signs it signs that document usually using COSE sign 1, and so this is going to cover the payload and protected header. So here, just as an example syntax, we're going to discuss some different syntax options later, but here we have a document, so we have a protected header at the beginning. We have nothing in the unprotected headers. We have a payload. We have some standard claims, the issuer, the subject, when the COT was issued. And then we have a new claim called redacted map keys. And inside there, we have hashes that represent any of the claims which were key value claims at that particular level of the hierarchy. We'll talk more about different options for how we can represent this, but this is the mechanism that is in the draft as it was submitted for the last 3 versions or so. Are there any questions up to this point?
I don't see anyone in queue.
All right. Once the issuer generates this, it hands it to the holder. The holder is going to do some sanity checking to make sure that this looks like what it expects. And then if the holder is satisfied with the document that it got from the issuer, then it can take this and present it to a verifier. It's going to present the issuer COT any of the disclosures that it would like to present. So remember, the issuer COT contains a redacted or blinded form of disclosures. And it can say, well, I would like to reveal, am I over 18? And I'd like to reveal what software version, one of these 2 software versions that I'm using. This is in addition to any claims that the issuer baked in that were mandatory to disclose. The holder also generates a holder key binding token. So this is a different CBOR web token, which is generated by the holder. So it is the issuer in that case. Using the private key that corresponds to the public key that was in the CNF claim in the issuer COT. This is required. So if you're familiar with the Jose or JSON Web Token parallel mechanism, selective disclosure JOTs, or selective disclosure JSON Web Tokens, this is one of the differences between this specification and that specification. Here, the holder key binding token is required. The holder key binding token can also include an audience, which is specific to the verifier. It can include a nonce. It can include some additional information to sort of tighten the scope of the presentation to the verifier. So the issuer COT might not include an audience, and then the holder says in its key binding token, I'm going to make this disclosure, but it's going to be specific to a particular audience. Next slide. All right, so why do we need key binding? Key binding prevents copy and paste or replay attacks on selected disclosures. So the holder both proves possession of their private key and also the choice of disclosures. So you can't have a disclosure which is given to a verifier which outs the holder without the signature failing. So it does this using the in this syntax, the SD hash claim. So this is a hash of all of the claims that are disclosed, and then of course that's in the payload of the key binding token, and then the entire key binding token protected and protected headers and payload are signed. And so that signature also needs to be verified. So it can't be impersonated by someone else who's not the holder or doesn't have the holder's private key. Next slide, please. Now, there are also some fancy things that we can do, and one of the most fancy is called nested disclosures. So here we can have data which is in a deep hierarchy. And so in this case, we have an address claim at the top level. Inside of that, we have a physical claim, which is a physical address or like directions or something like that. And then inside that, we have some individual claims. So the things in red are basically at the deepest level of hierarchy. The things in yellow are at the sort of an intermediate level of hierarchy, and the things in blue are at a large level of hierarchy. Next slide, please. So we could replace those, the claims at the inner level with redacted claims, as shown here. And we could go to the next slide and show how we can then replace the claims at the intermediate level with a set of redacted claims. So in this case, we've got the individual nationalities. Each of those nationalities has its own redacted claim. And finally, next slide, we finally have the top level. So we had here, if we go back 2 slides, we had three redacted claims at the innermost level. And we had, I believe, 5 claims at the intermediate level and another 3 claims at the top level. So there are 11 total claims here that manage to represent all of these nested disclosures. Pretty cool concept, huh? Okay, next slide, please. Finally, sometimes you may have a subject where you wish to reveal, to make disclosable many claims, but another subject where you don't have a lot of information and therefore the issuer can't make a lot of claims. And that information alone is enough for a verifier to make a guess, a good guess often, as to like a particular category of user. Like maybe this is a user who's not in the same country as most of the users, or they don't have, they don't have a particular property. And so in order to prevent that kind of information leakage, the issuer can also generate what are called decoy disclosures. And in this case, it just generates a disclosure which has a salt, and then that can be put in any of these list of redacted claims, so that a document for two different subjects will not be easily distinguishable one from another in a way that just by analyzing the number of redacted disclosures. That's it. Okay. Did you want to do these one? Okay. I will yield the mic to Ori.
Don't ever do that again, Ron. The whole wall just moved.
Sorry.
Hi, I'm Ori Steele, and I'm basically blind at this point, so I'm going to move a little closer so I can see this. So Rowan covered the introduction. I want to draw your attention to one of the key sort of technical structural challenges we've been having adopting selective disclosure in the CWT CBOR ecosystem. And it's the one red TBD that you see on the screen here. So this is an example of cozy sign 1 structure. So this is a common way to encode a protected header, a payload, and a digital signature in CBOR. This is the building block that is used to create CWTs. This building block is also used inside of the ISO MDoc format, and it's also used in other IETF protocols where you need to convey a digital signature for a payload and some metadata in a protected header. As Rowan has kind of introduced you to the concept of these CBOR claim keys, and I apologize in advance for the use of the word key, claim key, cryptographic key. When we say claim key, we mean in a map data structure, there's a key and a value. The key is on the left-hand side, the value is on the right-hand side. So when we're talking about redacting claim keys, we're talking about redacting the left-hand side, but you also want to redact the right-hand side as well. You don't want to leak any information about a redacted key value in some claim set. So here in this example, you see there's this one new red TBD. We need a way to convey that there's a claim key in this map that is redacted, and its values are the number of redactions at this layer of the map. And these maps can be nested inside of each other, or they can be mixed with arrays, so you can get these deeply nested data structures. It can get very complicated very quickly, but we really have the simple challenge in CBOR of what goes where the red TBD is in this data structure. One other comment is on the left-hand side of all these examples, you see these slashes and then human readable strings. This is CBOR extended diagnostic notation. The stuff within the slashes is just comments. So they're conveying, often those comments will kind of try and describe some, hexadecimal string or other integer value on the right-hand side. So I want to be careful for folks who may not be familiar with CBOR extended diagnostic notation. The slashes are comments, and in fact, at the top where you see the hashtag public key thumbprint, hashtag ES256, those are also comments. There's multiple ways to do comments in CBOR extended diagnostic notation. Okay, so in this example, we can see there's just two values that have been redacted from this CWT claim set, and we're going to try and figure out the different ways that we could go about tackling this TBD map key problem. And there's a couple solutions, and CBOR is a unique constraint for this. So let's get to it. Next slide. So I think at this point you've already seen these details, but just one more time, the redactions or disclosures are these the arrow notation. So chevron, square bracket, content, square bracket, chevron. That is representing CBOR encoding. So this tells you that this array of 3 elements is going to be CBOR encoded, and that's eventually going to become this hexadecimal string at the bottom with the H, and then the single ticks, and then hexadecimal strings.
The hash of the stuff in the chevrons becomes the...
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. So the Rowan's correct. When it's just a tiny redacted hexadecimal string, it's hard to remember what it is, and that's why we use comments usually. I think we've already kind of covered this example, so I'm happy to answer any questions folks have about the syntax or structure of EDN, because there's going to be a lot of EDN throughout this presentation, and if you have any questions about it, happy to take them. All right, next. So this section's about tagging redactions. And there's 2 cases that we have to cover. So we want to cover redaction in a map data structure, which involves redacting the map key and the map value. We also want to cover redaction in array data structures. And because of the unique capabilities of CBOR, we have tagging as a structural technique that we can use to express whether an element is the bare element, like a number or string or a byte string or whatever, or it's a redacted value. So we're going to try and use the sort of capabilities of CBOR to get a system for SD-CWT that is sort of in the style of building data structures in CBOR. Next slide. So we have some constraints as we go after this problem. The first constraint is we kind of don't want to break CWT processors. I suppose we could say right off the bat we're going to break everything. I don't think that would go over very well in the IETF. So CWTs have this this constraint, the sub bullet point, map keys must be integers or strings. So I've already kind of maybe biased you heavily against thinking about strings, because this is CBOR and not JSON. But if you feel really strongly that we should really be considering strings as map keys as part of this discussion, I'd love to have a conversation about that. But this is a constraint for CWTs that we want to preserve. And so now we're trying to think, okay, if it has to be an integer or it has to be a string, what value can we pick so that it's obvious that it's a redaction and not just a natural part of an interesting data structure that someone would be wanting to sign and present? We want to keep the payload size small. It's CBOR. What are we getting for all this compact binary if we're not getting small payload at the end of the day? And this last bullet point is really important, because depending on how we go after an integer or string, we might accidentally introduce a covert channel or some other weird part of the way that we did that encoding, that extra information could come through. We don't want that. We want it to just be, oh, you can see there's 3 things missing from this map or 3 things missing from this array. That's it. You shouldn't learn anything else. And there shouldn't be a way that a sneaky issuer can hide them in a special way to send some information to a sneaky verifier who knows how to interpret the issuer's sneakiness, for example. Next slide. So the redactions and keys. There's several options. I think let's just go quickly through all of them, and then maybe we can have a quick discussion around them. So the most obvious solution to this problem is to just pick a pretty large, weird-looking integer and say, minus 65536 is going to be registered in the CWT claim set registry, and that's the logical equivalent of the underscore SD claim that's registered in the JWT registry as part of SD JWT. So it's just a weird-looking claim that you wouldn't use for anything else, and it signals that there's redacted claims at this layer of the hierarchy. Next slide. Another solution that we were having this discussion on the list, and I was getting confused about how all of the fancy approaches that you can sometimes go after in CBOR by playing games with squinting at an integer in a specific way. So I don't believe that what's on the slide here is possible, but I've put it up here to embarrass myself in front of all of you to ask the question, is there anyone in the audience who can think of a way to make a really large, weird looking integer also be a tagged value in CBOR in some way? Because there's a sort of a symmetry in the design that I was hoping for here, because we use tagging to redact elements in an array. And it would be really nice if we could also use tagging to redact keys in a map. Then we would just say, here's this tag, and when you encounter it, it's a redacted array element. And here's this tag, and when you encounter it in a map key, it's a redacted map key. But I don't really understand how to make this possible, and I've already embarrassed myself permanently on the CBOR list by asking this question, trying to figure it out. And I see I've triggered Karsten. Mission accomplished.
Yeah, Carsten, when I took this seat beside the microphone for some reason, I don't remember. What we want to do is have something that stands out in a nested structure. And the question is, how can we do that? So this is requirement 1. The simplest way to have something that stands out is to assign one of the simple values that CBOR provides that nobody else uses for anything except for false, true, null, and undefined, and say, okay, we have another one of those, and we call that redacted, and that will sure stand out. So that's one way to solve that problem. Now, there's another requirement that I don't understand, which is, but it must be an integer or a string or a text string. No, you cannot have an integer or text string that stands out, because all integers and text strings are allowed already. So You cannot just say, oh, but this one you no longer can use, and this is for something special. So CBOR really has those standout things, which are not numbers and not strings, but are true or false or undefined or redacted, and we should use those.
Do you mean major types? So is that what you mean?
Well, in major type 7, there is a space of 256 minus a few simple values. We could use one of those. Again, true, false, null, undefined are the ones that are widely used, but we still have space for putting other ones in there.
But if we were to try and do that, wouldn't we be breaking compatibility with CWT processors that say the claim key has to be an integer or a string?
Well, claim keys, that's easy. We could just allocate 17, well, that's probably already allocated, 47, and say this is our redacted at that level. But claim keys only happen at the top. And if you actually need to go down into the structure, you need something that has this standout characteristic.
Agreed. Yeah. So just to unpack what he said, the top of the payload is a CWT claim set. It's a map. But if it contains any maps inside of it, those are, maybe you think of them as CWT claim set maps, but they could be other kinds of maps, and you still need to be able to identify their claim keys as being redacted.
Will?
Hi, Will, Southwest Grid for Learning. You could use an exclamation mark in front of the key name, and that would save you having to have the extra structure underneath.
I've got a word for that. That's Jason thinking.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. First of all, there already could be keys that have an exclamation mark in there, and second of all, it doesn't work for arbitrary nested structures.
I will say, though, that the way that this problem was solved in SDJWT was to use an underscore, which is maybe less exciting than an exclamation mark, but it's conceptually the same kind of idea.
Hi, Rowan May. Yeah, so everything Carsten said is correct. However, I think what we're talking about is a probability, not a certainty. So the probability that someone has a deeply nested map that they're using inside of an SD-COT that uses some unusual string value or some very large or small integer is unlikely, and this is, presumably once we publish a document that says this is how you do SD-COTs, anyone who is doing, who's doing SD-COTs and is doing redactions will probably, might hopefully have a glance at the set of claims that they allow and hopefully restrict very improbable ones. So I'm not too worried about the likelihood of this being a problem in practice, and we need to do something. So
it's bold. You assume people will read our document. I'm grateful.
I mean, to the extent that they read the document for anything else, they would probably notice this one thing, and maybe we could, maybe we could use the blink tag to, yeah.
Okay, Ron, sit down. You brought up the blink tag, but you also made Carsten pop right back up.
Yeah, Martin, if I can go quickly before you. There is no probability in security, because if you open something somewhere that used to be improbable and attackers notice it, they will increase the probability of that thing very much. So you never can argue with probability in security.
All right, Martin.
Yeah, I'm asking this question from the floor because Mike suggested it was a good one. I want to attack the premise of all of this exercise a little bit and try to get to the bottom of it. You suggested that it was necessary and in fact essential to maintain this integer or string key requirement that you have in COSE. And I want to push on that a little bit because I think there's potentially a small thing that you could do with tagging here that would make it incompatible with COSE strictly, which would be awkward, but it would only be incompatible to the extent that there is value in providing something with everything redacted. So anything that, if you were generating one of these tokens and you expected to be able to redact everything that was redactable and still be able to present that thing to someone, then within that particular use case, if there were people who were expecting a CWT at that point, then they'd be happy with that if you maintained that invariant. On the other hand, if you use tags, you're forcing them to update their software for that very specific narrow use case. And I think that's the sort of question that I think would be worth exploring just a little bit more, because one thing you could potentially do is update CWT and say you have to understand tags in map keys.
I agree with everything you said. A version of it, of what you said, has also been said on the list. And, you know, at least Michael Richardson had said, like, we should really think about updating CWT, because, you know, tagging is a fundamental advantage of CBOR, and we're kind of prohibited from using it in CWT. And, you know, we should maybe rethink that.
Yes, I'm going to second that we need to make sure to think about this very carefully for two reasons. One of which Mike Proruck, one of which Karsten pointed out, which is there is JSON thinking that has crept into things, and one of the very intentional choices for this is to go down a CBOR path, right? And so if we can leverage that fully, we should. I think the other desired property that we need to be very careful of, that I'm not sure people are thinking about when we're talking strings and numbers and stuff like that, is that you will 100% have issuer and verifier collusion if we allow non-deterministic set, you know, like if the user has any control over that, people like me will exploit it. So let's not let that happen.
All right, I think that's it for this slide. So this is here to read the room on an alternative proposal. The previous structure that you saw is really inspired by the solution that SDJWT used, which was to say, for this layer, for this map, if there's 3 redactions, there'll just be one redacted map key and an array for each of the redactions. So if there was 3 redacted elements in a JSON object, there would be one JSON object property and an array of 3 elements. In CBOR, it's the same thing in the previous example. This example is exactly the kind of thing that Mike was just talking about. We are taking the redactions and we're kind of keeping their count the same. So if you count claim keys in the map, in the redacted and unredacted expression, you get the same number of claim keys. The way that you are doing that is by injecting left-hand side claim key values for each redaction. And now you need, you know, either you're going to allow duplicate map keys and everyone's going to cry, or you're going to introduce some, you know, different version of redaction for each map key. And I think people will also be unhappy with that. So I wonder if anyone wants to come to defend this particular idea, because I don't really want to, but it's here in case you think that there's some strategy in here that, you know, we should pursue. All right, let's move along. This is the same structure as the other one, just without tags. It's exactly the same thing. I think unless someone wants to argue for, yeah. So can you actually go back one? So the previous one showing this sort of thinking about the map key that's being redacted as being a tag value, like this is strictly speaking not legal in CWT, whereas if you advance one slide, this is legal in CWT, but like it's not really that great.
Karsten.
So maybe we can go back to what we're trying to do here. So we have this map, and some of the entries in this map are disclosed. So we just put their label and their value there. And some are not disclosed. And the only thing we have for those is the byte string of the hash. So the obvious way to solve this problem would be to have one entry in the map that has an array with all those byte strings. But you can do other things. You might use the byte string as the label and use a null value. So there are lots of ways to cook this one, and I don't have a particular preference, but I would like to avoid requiring invalid CBOR, which the previous slide was.
So just to be clear, right, the idea of duplicate map keys, you're definitely not in favor of. Is that?
No, because implementations are going to throw away all the
Good.
entries except for one.
Good.
Mike?
Mike Jones, I'll quote Kirsten, there's no probability in security. This is a terrible idea. Even if the working group put it forward, you wouldn't survive IASG review.
I don't want to defend this anymore. Can we?
I don't know, one more person?
Or yeah, one more speaker.
Okay. Well, we actually have two.
Or yeah.
And then we're going to close the
fine.
queue on this, I guess. Please.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm new here from Huawei Research and Development. So I just figured out how to ask a question. So I want to ask a general question. I think the selective disclosure is very useful, especially for the future ICT system, like our cell phones. And I think the concept is kind of close to the digital identity proposed by the W3C. It's kind of, I don't know if you have any discussion in the BOF because I'm not involved in it, but they call it like the verifiable credential and something like that. So do like the CBOR with salt solution have any connection with their contributions? Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so just to quickly respond, when we're forming this working group in the IETF, we talked about the history of these kinds of things. An earlier version of this was called attribute certs, attribute certificates. The JSON Web Tokens are, you know, in the lineage that's brought us to this point. So we had attribute certs, we had JSON Web Tokens, we had CBOR Web Tokens. The W3C has a similar technology that's looking at the claim key structure in a different way. That's like the primary way that I think about the difference between the W3C specifications and the ones at the IETF is the IETF ones for JWT and CWT. The way you understand the semantics of the claim keys, you go to the IANA registry to read about them, you register them, or you negotiate in some way with between your issuer and verifier. These values have this special meaning. The W3C has a different way of thinking about that structure. But you're right that these are all sort of similar approaches to solving the problem, or their approaches to binding attributes to a cryptographic key so that when that key is used, these attributes can be verified.
Richard, and then we'll
Hey, Ori, so in SDJOT, we avoid this problem of what keys to use for the redacted values by having a ... key in a subdictionary. Why is that not what we're doing here?
Yeah, so the ... key is used for redacting an array element. Our proposal in this draft is to use a CBOR tag for redacting an array element.
No, you've got it backwards. So array elements are redacted by just having the hashes at their positions in the array. Dictionary key values are placed inside a subdictionary where the subdictionary is under the ... key.
I'd love to talk with you offline about it. There's two cases both drafts need to address. One case is I'm redacting an array element, And the other case is I'm redacting one or more key value pairs in a map. The syntax in the SDJOT spec is _SD for the redacting keys and the
Oh,
dot for redacting array elements. As
yeah,
I
sorry, you're
remember.
correct. Yeah,
It's
sorry about
possible
that.
that I
Yeah.
don't remember, but conceptually you're right. Like we're just trying to do the same kind of thing. And one of the advantages of CBOR here is like we can drop the object with a single key structure. We can just replace that with a CBOR tag, which is smaller, and I think it's nicer. But conceptually, that's how we're solving the redacting an array element problem. On the redacting a key value problem, we're currently proposing to do basically the same thing with a weird looking integer instead of the string _SD.
Okay, thanks.
Next slide. All right. Next slide. Okay, so to this point, we've been kind of focusing your attention on this like primary issue of how to express redactions in the claim sets. There is another interesting opportunity here. For some background, you know, we're in Spice, we're always going to be talking about what did JWT do, what did HOSI do, what did CWT do, what did COSI do. So we're looking at these two different pillars of IETF protocols, and we're thinking, is there a reason for them to do the same thing intentionally, or is there a good reason for them to diverge? And we want to be intentional about where we diverge. I think Justin Richard told me one time, like, there's important reasons why COSI made some of the choices that it made, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. So we want to make sure that as we do this kind of thing for CWT moving forward, we also are able to make good decisions where we can to diverge from how SDJWT may have handled these. So one of the things you've already seen is like they're mandating the key binding token. That's a divergence. Another one that we've been discussing is where to put the SD hash or the disclosures. And so this next part of the presentation is just going to be talking about that problem. I hope there's a good slide on the next one to talk about it. This will work. So the way that these presentations work is you have the issuer signed CWT, and you have all of the payload in that issuer signed CWT is redacted. When you want to, or all the fields that can be redacted are redacted in that document. When you want to disclose them, you have to convey the disclosures. And usually we convey the disclosures in an SDJWT by tacking them on to the end of the JWT token and passing them along. And then maybe we put a key binding token on the end of that, and then that's a disclosure with key binding. In CBOR, we have this unprotected header bucket, which is really, really awesome tool, but also very dangerous because it's unprotected. So one of the things that we do with the unprotected header is we include information like the key binding token for the issuer signed token can go in the unprotected header. The SD hash is the, or the disclosures can go in the unprotected header. So if we were to just kind of mirror how SDJWT solves this problem, we would take the issuer signed token, we would take the disclosures, we would put the disclosures in the unprotected header, we would take the hash of the disclosures, we put the hash in the key binding token, we put that in the unprotected header, and we send the entire thing along. I'm sorry that that's probably impossible to follow saying it out loud, but that's a pretty reasonable solution to the problem. It's exactly how SDJWT solved it. And one of the things we've been discussing is, you know, with key binding tokens being mandatory, is there a better solution that we can leverage in CWT? Because we'll always know you're always going to get a key binding token. And so we've been discussing the idea of putting, instead of putting the SD hash in the key binding token and then conveying the disclosures separately, what if we just put the disclosures in the key binding token and conveyed that. So it's one less cryptographic operation, the hash function for the selective disclosure. You know you're always going to be conveying a key binding token, so you know those disclosures are always going to be bound to the specific use of that key, so the same kind of replay, attack mitigation, and freshness properties are going to be in play. This would be a divergence from SDJWT, and it's a divergence both in the sense that the key binding token is mandatory, and a divergence in the sense that we would be offering the ability to convey disclosures differently as claims in the key binding token. Yep. Advance. Great.
Unless you're going to separate it with a tilde, you're doing something different anyway.
Daniel?
It's
We have
Daniel.
someone crawling the chairs.
I'd love to hear Daniel's take on this. I'd love, and a response to the previous one, if you don't mind.
Yeah, we need more squigglies. So on that, we didn't sign over the whole ST-JOT and disclosures, mainly because it would produce a huge document. So we do the JOT encoding, and then we have base64 encoding, then we base64 encode that again, we sign over it again. Now, please ignore my ignorance towards CBOR, but I understand that you don't have the same size penalty there. So I would just put like sign over the whole thing. And we didn't, so one of the reasons why this is not, so what you're doing is not in the ST-JOT spec is because that we said you can make different choices to accommodate the specific properties of the format you're using, because just as we did for JSON and JWS stuff. So yeah, why not do that? There's no price for aligning those things as closely as possible.
So if I understand your suggestion, it's, one, maybe allow people to sign, use the key binding token to sign the entire issuer sign. And then the other side of what you're saying is, and maybe don't even make that the only way to do it. Allow people to convey other cryptographic.
No, I would do it. So that would be the only way. You sign the whole thing. So in the key binding token, you have both the issuer signed original token and the disclosures. Bam. So
but only offer that.
As long as there's no size penalty involved or any other strange things happening. Okay. That's what I would do. That's what I would have done if we hadn't had that size penalty in JOTs.
Yeah. Thank you.
Rohan? Okay. So at this point, Ori, do you have what you need?
I do. The next steps are basically to continue these discussions on the list, and that's it. Thank you.
Alrighty then. Next up, we're going to get a little bit sticky on this one, and we have Brent to talk about glue.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. So in the intro to SPICE and what we're doing, one of the jobs of the group is to identify gaps and fill those gaps with things that people need in credentials. Glue is one of those things that I need and other folks have said they need. So that's why I'm here and that's why I'm talking to you. A glue ID is a representation of another identifier. It's a wrapper. It's a little bit of extra context. And when we combine that extra context with a registry, it allows people who in the past would get a number and not know what the heck it was to get a number and a little bit more and know exactly what they're looking at. That's what it boils down to. That's what we want to do. So instead of this, many digit number, they get glue, colon, and this identifier portion with the number. And then they can look up in the registry what this identifier is supposed to be pointing to. Next slide, please. This is what we imagine the registry could look like. we'd have the name of the thing, we'd have a scheme identifier, which would be a, like that, and then a reference to what it pertains to. And then we have some examples of what the identifiers look like. This could theoretically grow. This could be bigger. This could include, like, the registry could end up including like who's the change controller and all of that. But I think, we would need to get there. I'm happy to take questions as we go, though. So if Rowan wants to.
Rohan?
Hi, Rowan May. So this is supposed to be this whole thing is supposed to be a URN? Or,
Yes.
Okay. And is there a reason, I did post this on the list, but I didn't really follow up, but why we wouldn't have it be like, say, glue.com.dnb :duns or glue:/gov.irs::ein, so that the things that are the scheme thing is domain scoped.
We could do that. The reason that we didn't jump down that is because I imagined that the same domain could theoretically have multiple schemes.
Right. So in the case, I mean, that's why I said, com.dnb: :duns. So Dun and Bradstreet could come up with a new Duns Light number, or like Duns Small Enterprise number, and that would be an additional thing inside of the authority of dnb.com.
Would the goal of that to be not to no longer need the registry?
I think it would be to prevent a land grab over a particular, an additional place to have a land grab over a short string.
Okay, I'm not opposed to that. And I think it's a valuable discussion to continue having. Next slide, please.
Oh,
Scott, or do you want to take a
sorry,
question
next
from
person,
Richard?
please. Sorry.
yeah, quick question on this one. And hopefully this is an obvious question. So like we already have a URN construct and a registry of URN, I forget what they call them, but the next division down in the URN space. So like this seems a lot like that. How do you think of this differently from that?
Sorry, I'm not fully following the question.
So you've heard of URIs, URLs. There's also these uniform resource names, which are just kind of opaque identifiers like what you've got here. There's URN : I think you can have ISBNs as a URN. There's a variety of URN categories. Typically you see URN : next label : and then the scheme is beyond that. So yeah, hopefully as I'm describing this, you can kind of see how this looks similar to what you got on this slide. Just wondering if you had looked at that, and if so, like how you were thinking of it differently, or maybe that's a thing to investigate.
I think we were going for a concentration of these elements in their own registry rather than jumping into the other space.
So the one way you could achieve that, though, within the existing framework is you could define a URN subname space for this thing, and then you could dump those, within that.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, then the spec would be to define that and how that works. I mean, but as long as the end result capabilities are there, I think however the structure fits together should be fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Not opposed to that.
We have Pam.
Hello, Pam Dingle. So I think there is one other consideration here that we have to keep in mind. What we are essentially doing is registering namespaces, right? Identifier namespaces. And we're not only doing that for now, we're doing it over time. And so the one discussion point we would have to work through, I think, for the domain concept is, in theory, you could have that domain represent different namespaces over time, and you would still have to be able to differentiate between those namespaces. And that's where the complexity comes into this, is trying to keep all of that straight, not just for now, but for, for evolving namespaces over potentially decades.
Thank you, Pam. All right, so what we consider in scope for this draft is we want to say what these identifiers look like, and we want to define what the registry is and how it works. And beyond that, we don't really want to talk about much. We want to keep it pretty simple. We anticipate in the future we could, have other drafts that talk about where these things are used. Are we going to try to bind keys to them? All of that stuff. But for now, we want to keep it very simple and very light.
Mike?
Yeah, Mike Perrock here. I see strong utility to this and possibly applicability in SPICE if we are very specific to the use case of saying, how do I deal with corporate identities, which may be pointing to the same thing, but have different issuing authorities for those numbers, controllers, rules, possible fragments and things like that attached. There are some really unique things we see in the wild around these types of identifiers. And SPICE credentials have to typically refer back to these kinds of corporate entities, not people type cases, right? This is very much around the corporate side. I think the draft and the presentation as it stands now just feels way too ambiguous and loose to actually be very specific to the problem that I think exists, which is, and I'll use US Customs as an example, where they've gone through and said that we're going to have a global ID, for entities, right? And so they've put this program out. And in reality, you go in and you look at that and says, well, this global ID is just one of 3 different identities, which may be in conflict with each other, right? Which is a really funny problem to go deal with when you're a regulatory agency. So we need a way to go through and say, hey, I've got one or more of these things from, different issuing bodies, some of whom may not even be represented by IANA. And that's actually a real challenge, right? When we start having to reference corporate entities that may exist, say in Iran or North Korea, et cetera. And so those are things that we really have to be able to make sure we're able to capture clearly and say, yep, I know this identifier exists. I'm going to claim that this is about something, or I'm going to reference this identifier. But this draft kind of points me in that direction, but doesn't really feel like it's there yet. So that's just my feedback at this point.
I totally agree. So the goal of the draft is to present the problem that we're trying to solve and our thoughts around a possible solution. The draft hasn't been adopted by the group, but if you guys think it's a worthwhile thing to work on, we'd love to see it adopted by the group so that we could figure out how to namespace it properly, figure out exactly how to use the registry. Do we just use a URN or do we use this glue thing? And how do we make it actually work for people who need to identify corporations over time and in as much specificity as is needed? Like these, yeah, we recognize there are open questions. I personally take the fact that people are asking the questions as an indication that maybe this would be worth adopting, but I'm also biased. So since the last time we talked to y'all, we raised issues for every comment that was made at the mic and every question that folks had. We tried to raise a PR to answer that. So we, added some language around privacy because some identifiers identify people as well as corporations. In terms of minting these identifiers and using them, we added language for that and got into a little bit more about the why and why here. So all of those changes are reflected. Some stuff that we didn't go into yet was specifics around the registry structure. We didn't yet say, okay, if you have a glue DUNS identifier and as an organization want to add your own organizational notes to that as part of the identifier, should that be possible? How should that be formatted? Or if you have an LEI that points to a corporation, but you want to point to a specific location of a factory owned by that corporation, would we want to enable that as well? Like there are excellent questions. We want to have conversations around answering them, and the most appropriate way to do that would be for us to have this as a work item somewhere, and we'd love to have it be a work item here.
Richard?
So I think we should absolutely not adopt this until we can answer the question of how it's different from URNs. Because as far as I can tell from this presentation, and I apologize, I haven't read the drafts, it seems like it's solving exactly the same problems that URNs solve. There's already a registry of URN namespaces that have vendor-specific things in them. So like if you want vendor-specific namespaces in a thing that looks like a uniform resource something, that's your game. So if we're going to do anything, we need to understand why it's not already covered by this widely used existing art. It's also not clear to me why this is in scope for the SPICE charter, which I also don't have in front of me, but that would be something we would need to address before we adopted it.
So what I'd like to do is I think I have a quick poll just to ask the question, do we think this is something that needs to come into working group adoption? See if I can actually do that correctly. Yes, no, no opinion.
Even if this says yes, we'll need to address the question that Rich raises. Yeah. Which might mean we adopt it in the sense that the chairs then have to go off and find its real home, which might be somewhere else. And that will be a conversation with a number of people, I imagine. It's a bit split here. Can we get perfectly even across all three options?
I know, I'm like, okay, now this is like, anyone ever go to a meeting where you played the duck race? Anyone? No? No? They put that on the screen just to see which little rubber duck you managed to float down the virtual river faster.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think this is at least clear enough to me that probably a bit more discussion and trying to work on what is it really that you're adding that is not your ends, all of those other questions that came up.
Thank you for the time.
So,
thanks, Brent.
Definitely a problem to solve, and we'll talk about where. Okay. We have one here. You go away. You go here. Claims. OIDC claims.
Where is it?
He's over there. Come on up, Belgium.
It's behind the mic stand.
By the way, all of you who have fallen asleep, we can totally see that.
It's okay. I mean,
and I'm not going to name names, but someone may have started drooling, and we can see that too. All right.
Hi, I'm Beltram. So, as the chair reminded us, so this working group is about filling gaps. And so when I was porting like an SD-JOT library to SD-COT, I think I found some of those gaps. And when I had a use case when I had to deal with PII, so personal information, and I couldn't find, so I went to the INI registry, to the COT registry, and I couldn't find the claims related to personal identities. So namely those who are in the OIDC defined. So next slide, please.
There we go.
So basically I wrote this draft to have those registers. So this draft is aimed at being simple and straight to the point. So it's request registering like 19 of the 20 claims in the OIDC claims. So the subject one was already registered, so it doesn't need to be done once again. The goal here is to go to standard claims registration, so try to find something in the 2 byte range, hopefully, because those claims are pretty prevalent, so it might make sense to have something short as a payload size matters in CBOR. So that's what we're trying to do here. Next slide, please. So basically, those are the claims I'm mentioning. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with those. So the draft, I was trying to publish a version 1 like a few minutes ago. I failed, but basically I'm going to release soon version 1 of the draft. It has been reviewed by IANA, so I had the early review. And basically this is just like a call for feedback and a call for review. Yeah. That's it.
Okay, how many of you have actually read this document? Good, excellent. We want more people. Mike, you're in queue.
Yeah, Mike Jones. I support this idea. I hope the authors update the draft so it was probably an acceptable form for IANA. So we should just do this. I mean, the only open question in my mind is, are there other commonly used claims that you should put into the same bucket? But we could adopt it and then sort that out.
And I think maybe some of those, namely the address, for example, could be useful for some groups like DIM, digital emblems, if it ever exists. But yeah.
Philip?
Philip Skokan, hi. I came here to ask if you left out address intentionally.
Yeah. No, it is. It's scrapped here.
Okay.
But it's there. Yeah.
Hi, Rowan May. Yeah, I think this is a good idea. I think it's kind of like, why didn't somebody do this sooner? Great. As for the size, like I'm not so worried if it's a slightly bigger key, if it's like in the expert review sort of range, which I think is 3 or 4 octets, and so like I'd be totally okay with that. If the consensus is to go with standards, I'm okay with that too. I'm kind of leaning to like just do it quickly and do it with expert review, but I'm also okay with what's in the draft now.
Other thoughts, other comments? Roy?
Roy Williams. The only concern I have here is this is really user focused, not what it maps to for a corporation is the name is not an end user's full name, right? So the overlap between a company and a person kind of blurs these a bit. So if we can clear that up, it'd be great.
What do you see the overlap with the company?
Well, you have name, end user's full name, displayable form. It's the name of the company, or is it a person only? This gives the impression that it's a person only.
Yeah.
It is.
Yes, so, but it doesn't have to be. That's the point.
Yeah, we can broaden the scope for sure. We don't need to map one-to-one what is in IDC for sure.
Ori?
So, Ori Steele, the history of these specific claims is that they were popularized within OpenID Connect and JWT claims, and they were used as tokens that were for identity tokens for human users, right? So that's why they look personal credential oriented in their as registrations. It isn't to say that if there was a group of legal entity identifier claims that were common in identity tokens. Perhaps RATS has made a couple claim registrations that are sort of more device identity or vendor identity oriented. And those maybe would be closer to the kinds of claims you'd expect for identifying a device in a corporation or a corporation that's associated to a token or that kind of thing. But these claims the reason they look like personal credential claims is that they're mirroring very successful personal credential claims that have been used in JWT.
Yeah, as you reminded us earlier, like my personal usage of those is in COT tokens. And since I'm not allowed to use tags, so I'd rather have those claims keep that semantic rather than the device semantic or corporation semantic or whatever.
Mike?
Yeah, Mike Jones. I support registering them with exactly the same semantics as in the JOT claims registration. And to Roy's point about it being called name, yeah, that's the human readable description of what we have in the specs. But in fact, it'll turn into something like 537 as the actual tag. And, if you want an org ID claim or what have you, you can also define that, and that might be 632.
Richard?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of plus one with what other folks are saying. Like the fact that this doesn't cover all the use cases is not a reason not to do it. Like we can cover a bunch of use cases with this. We know a bunch of use cases it's good for. So let's do this. And if there's other use cases we need to cover, like do different registrations for that.
All right. Mike, you get the last question on this one. Then it's my turn.
Yeah, Mike Perrock. I think it would be very useful to have OIDC claims available in CBOR. Like, it seems like a no-brainer. It might be better from a naming of the claim names, right? To prefix them that they're OIDC, et cetera, since they're translating to binary, and then we know exactly what they're for. So.
All right, I'm now going to put up a poll. This is the, do you think this should come into this working group for adoption? I'd like to know what you think. Yes, no, no opinion? Click the button, click it.
I should say, as we go through this, it's quite possible that after we've had a conversation with the COSE chairs and the other chairs of the related working groups, that this ends up in a different working group than this one. A yes here just means any one of them, ultimately. It's the right way to think of this one, because this sort of seems partly firmly in our charter and also partly firmly in the COSE working group's charter in terms of this is just making COSE more usable. So we'll sort that out with the chairs.
Fortunately, we do have one of the chairs here.
As a COSE chair, I'm fine with it being here. There's sufficient overlap in participation that the right thing will happen. And in fact, historically, CBOR Web Token was not COSE, it was ACE.
Right.
All right. So that did look strongly in favor. We will confirm on the mailing list as one does. With that, we've got 9 minutes left. I know we have a couple of AOB items. Beltram, thank you so much. Ori, you wanted to talk about tools?
Testing.
That's all right. Do that for 2 seconds, and then we'll bring Mike up for 2 seconds. And then we'll go get coffee.
All right, Ori Steele. So I had sent the chairs email ages ago as we started to talk about the changes we're discussing to make to SDCWT. I had said, hey, you know, one of the things that SDJWT did really, really well was they published these test vectors, test fixtures that describe the input, the output. They kind of broke things apart. They were really easy to read as a developer. I could parse them and, you know, build them into my test harness and compare. There were some challenges with them, which I'd just like to say at the mic so that we could think about why we might not want to do the same things. But one of the things that, you know, I struggled with using those test fixtures was differences in like the white space in JSON encoding or you know, things like that. Differences between how Python might encode JSON and JavaScript might encode JSON. So the comment that I wanted to make is if we're going to make SDCWT really easy for people to implement, it might be nice to put in our IETF GitHub organization a repository of SDCWT test examples, test fixtures, where you could see the input, you could see the output. We could leave some, you know, explanatory text about why is this a good example? Why should you implement support for it and check it? We could put some nasty negative cases in there. I'm happy to do the work, but I wanted to, that's it.
Lisa, all in favor, just at this point, wave your hand around.
Yeah,
This
I think
is
we're
good. It's
going
an
to,
AOB.
like, someone else is going to do some great work. Let's applaud that.
We all did. Okay.
There's a lot of ways we can tell this. I think we'll probably have a discussion about whether that turns into a document or simply a tool.
Yep. Okay. Mr. Prorock, I think you had a quick AOB.
He's going to climb the stage.
No, he's going to go to a microphone and not climb the stage like a sensible person.
I could probably shout. I can occasionally voice of
do
command it. Mike Perrock here. Just a quick AOB. I've dropped it in the chat, but there is similar to the OIDC claims thing. I did drop up one specifically related to traceability. So just something to throw stones at. Just want people to be aware that it's there so we can read it and then look at possible adoption at a later date if that seems sensible. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. All right. Martin, do we have anything else?
I don't. Thank you all.
Brilliant. Thank you all for your time, your attention, and your being in a great big room. Well done.
Yes.
The applause sounds so sad.
Not here. The lights even come down. Cool.